Before I start doing anything, I want to make sure that the battery is disconnected. I'm going to disconnect the negative terminal and I'm going to set it aside. Unbolt the negative terminal, take it off and set it aside to where it can't make contact with the terminal. Since the starter is located underneath the intake on this car, we're going to have to take everything off, and I'm going to start by removing this throttle body cover. Should just have two 10mm nuts. Next thing is to take this off, so disconnect all the vacuum hoses that are attached to it. There's one on this side, there's a connector for the mass airflow, and then there are 3 vacuum hoses on the back. Those have to come off. Loosen up the 2 hose clamps on both ends. Once you've done that, you can pull it off of the air filter housing and then the throttle body. Next, I'm going to unplug the throttle body. If you have a cable operated throttle body, you're gonna have to disconnect the cable, set this aside, and then disconnect these vacuum hoses here. If you think you're gonna forget where they go, you can always take a picture before you take it apart, or you can watch this video. This one should have coolant in it. This vehicle's been sitting for a while and it's had its coolant drained several times, so for me there isn't much on here, but this is coolant. And this one you don't have to disconnect because it loops around to the bottom, but you do have to disconnect this one right here, and it's easiest for me to disconnect it on the water pump. There we go. Some coolant did come out of here too. All right, the throttle body I'm going to leave attached to the intake when I pull the intake out. On the driver's side of the intake, you can just remove the bracket for this whole assembly. 12mm bolt. Take this out of the way. I'm going to start this bolt back in. And here you can either remove the bracket or just pop out the wiring harness. Next, I'm going to disconnect some vacuum hoses up here. So I'll remove this one, separate these 2 right here, and then you can either disconnect the hose or just remove this bracket and flip it over. Just like that. Whoops. Next, disconnect the vacuum hose for the brake booster. On the passenger side, I'm going to remove the PCV hose that sits right here. That's going to make for a little bit more access to the injector harness here, which we have to unplug. On the back of this wiring harness, there are some clips that if you pry towards the intake, it will release from the brackets. You can also unbolt the brackets, but I feel like this is easier to do. All right, and the next step is to remove the fuel injector connectors. There are 4 on each side. You're gonna have to do this to both sides. And the tab that locks them in is underneath. So press on that, squeeze it down, and pull up. Sometimes it's actually easiest with some needle nose pliers. You can slide the pliers underneath, press and pull up. If you want to remove this whole harness and flip it over, which I'm gonna do just for ease of access, the throttle body's already unplugged. Unplug the mass airflow sensor. Unplug this connector down here, and then all 4 of the ignition coils. And now you can take the harness and just flip it up and over out of your way. And now do the same thing to the other side. Next, you want to remove all the mounting hardware that's holding this intake on, and you want to remove the lower intake, not the upper intake. So don't touch these bolts up here. This upper intake and the lower intake can stay together, as well as the fuel rail with everything. And once I take it off, I'm going to bring it up and over and put it to the side right here, and that's going to allow me to leave the fuel lines connected and just put the intake to the side. We'll do our starter and then bring it back. There are 4 nuts, 1 on each corner, and then 6 bolts in total, 3 on each side. They're all 12 millimeter. So I'm gonna work my way from the outside in. I'm gonna start with the 4 nuts and then the outermost bolts working towards the middle. With a magnet, fish out all the bolts. Whoops. Well, I made a mistake and I'll share it. I disconnected. I was looking at the right bolt, but when my impact gun went down there, it went on the wrong bolt. And once I take this intake off, I'll show you. I actually took off a bolt for the coolant passage back here as opposed to the intake. So I'm gonna put this one back and remove the correct one. Now the one I was supposed to remove is right next to it, right here. There we go. Now the intake can come up and out. So just like I mentioned, I'd like to bring it up, remove it from its mounting point. The nuts that are on the end have studs, so it's gonna have to come up to clear those studs. It's probably easiest if you grab the intake by the fuel rails and lift up. All right. It's heavier than you think. All right, that seems to have given us room to the starter. When you pull this up, just be very careful of debris falling in the intake ports. Pull it up gently. I'm gonna clean up all this debris in here and make sure that these gaskets are still good. It's best to put new ones on. If you really have to, reuse them, but it's best to put new ones on. But either way, I'm gonna clean up everything with a vacuum and then we'll get the starter out. Oh, and when I said that I took off the wrong nut, I actually took off that one back there instead of this one right here. They're the same exact looking nut. I was looking at this one, but then when I put my extension down there, it went onto that one and I didn't see. Anyway, just something to pay attention to. The next thing I want to do is move this wiring harness out of the way. So remove these 2 10mm bolts. If you want, you can cover your intake ports so nothing falls in. All right, at this point, this harness can move. Perfect. Next, I'll work on disconnecting the wiring harness from the 2 knock sensors and then from the starter. Underneath this clip, there's a little tab that if you pull down on, it'll unlock the harness from its retainer. Remove this connector for the starter. Once it's unbolted, we can access the other connector for the power wire that's down there. Right there, you can see a 12mm bolt that holds this harness in place. So go ahead and remove that. All right, once that's broken free, it should actually come off by hand pretty easy. All right, and now there is one bolt right there. That's the head of the bolt. And then underneath this wiring harness, which I know you can't see, but right now I can't see it either. It's basically right underneath there. If you just look at the new starter, you'll see that they're right across from each other. So unbolt that one, 14 millimeter, same to that. Okay, this one's out. Uh-oh. It's out. Yay! There it is. There's the other one. Now you can pull the starter away. Maybe seized on there, of course. Grab a little rubber mallet, dead blow hammer, whatever you have, and just tap it. It's unbolted right now. It's just seized on there because it's an aluminum starter or an iron block. I don't want to spray too much down there, but hopefully this helps it along. I'm basically just trying to work it up and down until it breaks free, because it's unbolted. There's nothing holding it on anymore. You can see it's separated a little bit, but it's not quite enough. Problem is, where the starter meets the engine block and transmission, the ring around the starter, where the starter goes through the hole, is aluminum, and that is a steel plate right there, iron. So when it corrodes, it's in there forever. So that's what I'm fighting, basically breaking it free from its mounting location. Got it. Now, you can unbolt that wire with a pocket screwdriver, open up this little flap cap, whatever thing for the power wire, and that should be a 12 millimeter nut in there. Okay, I'm gonna pry this up because I don't really see any other way of getting to this nut. The plastic keeps getting wedged in there. All right, I'm just gonna do this with a wrench. There we go. This nut should not be tight. It's just really hard to get to. Now it'll come off by hand. Remove that, remove the nut, and here's your old starter. And as you can see, this is the issue right here. That part was completely seized into that hole right there. So here's the hole that had the issue, and I'm gonna clean it up. I'm gonna use a file because that's the most efficient thing I have that will fit in here and properly clean this hole. I'm not worried about taking away too much material because, well, I won't be taking away any material. This is just steel here. All I'm trying to do is remove the corrosion, and it looks like it's working very well. I don't feel any more corrosion, so I'm going to put some anti-seize on that. That way, for if the starter ever has to be replaced again or removed for whatever reason, it'll come out much easier as opposed to what I just had to do. So get your new starter ready and take the nut off for the power wire and then connect the wire. Go ahead and connect the wire. If it has any corrosion, mine was pretty clean, but if it has any corrosion, go ahead and wire brush it so that it can make a good connection. And then start the nut, then we'll snug it up. This new nut is actually a 13 millimeter, unlike the old one. Make sure the wire is bottomed out completely. And once you have it bottomed out, go ahead and snug it up. You don't have to make it crazy tight, but make sure it is tight. Just don't over tighten it because the brass stud can break easily. All right, tighten that up. Lower the starter a little bit so that the plastic doesn't bend anymore. And then lock in the little cap. Now line up the starter with its hole and slide it in. There we go, perfect. And now put in the bolts back there. Okay, I got one. That one, you kind of have to feel for it. You're going in blind. Can't really see much. All right, so that one's started. Now I'll start the other one, then I'll tighten them both up. I'm gonna drive them in by hand as much as I can to avoid having to use my socket and ratchet in that little tiny space there. Thankfully, this one went in all the way. Now, this does have a torque, but there's no way I'm getting a torque wrench in there, so I'm going to use my ratchet and just make it as tight as I can by hand without obviously over tightening it. This one's the hardest one because you can't see it. Now, I'm not going to go for crazy tight, but it does have to be somewhat tight. Give it a couple bonks. That's perfect right there. And now do this one, which is going to be a lot easier. All right, that's nice and tight. And I have one more bolt back here, and this one right here for the wiring harness. Starting this one is not easy because you have to hold the wiring harness in place. Whew, I got it. Here we go, let's snug it up. All right, make that nice and tight. Remove any rags or paper towels, whatever you used to keep debris out of here. I had some coolant spilling in there, so I soaked it all up. So remove these. Now it's best if you clean these off. I've already scraped them off a little bit. You can use a flat razor blade and just gently scrape off the debris that's on top. Don't forget to connect your connectors here for the knock sensors and secure the wiring harness in place. And of course, don't forget the trigger wire for the starter. Make sure they all click in. Now when it comes to these gaskets, of course it's best to get new ones. If you absolutely have to, you can reuse your old ones, just clean them up. Clean up this surface here with the razor blade and make sure that no debris falls down into the intake ports. Same to this side and same to the back of the intake. You want to clean up the back of the intake as best as you can. Next, grab the intake manifold and put it into place. Make sure you don't pinch any wires or hoses. Line it up with the 4 studs, one on each corner. Now it should drop in perfectly once it's lined up. And at this point I'm going to start all of my hardware. It doesn't matter which order I start them in. It'll matter when it comes time to tightening it. So put on all of your nuts and bolts. Again, 4 nuts, 1 on each corner, and then 6 bolts, 3 on each side. As I attach my hardware, I'm going to make sure it starts on the threads properly so it doesn't cross thread. All right, so I'm going to snug them all up. I'm going to start from the center going out And I'm not going tight at all. I just want to make them bottom out so I can then torque them properly. Tighten the intake from the inside, working your way out. The torque is 13 foot-pounds, but I'm gonna do it in 2 passes. I'm gonna go around once at 7 foot-pounds so I can seat it evenly and then torque it to the final torque, which is 13 foot-pounds. This being only 7, it might already be there, but it's better to make sure. All right, now I'm going to step it up to 13 foot-pounds, which is the final torque. Now everything is torqued to 13 foot-pounds. I'm going to go around one more time to double check all of the hardware, and then we can move on. This time I'm not going to go in a sequence, I'm just going to go around in a circle. Now you can connect everything on the driver's side that was disconnected. When you connect the injectors and any electrical connection really, just make sure that it clicks in, otherwise it won't be secured and it can fall out and break the connection at any point. Alright, we have all the fuel injectors plugged in, all the ignition coils are plugged in. I'm going to go ahead and reconnect this PCV hose right here. Put this back, reinstall the 12mm bolt that secures it in place. Snug it up, reconnect the electrical connector, make sure it clicks. All right, make sure the hoses are seated properly, and reattach this hose and pipe with these two 10mm bolts. Snug these up. Make sure you connect your brake booster hose back in. And put the clamp back on. Now everything should be all set on this side. Let's move on to the passenger side. Bring the wiring harness over and connect this into place. Don't forget about the mass airflow sensor connection. And I'm gonna reinstall the PCV hose in here. Bring this vacuum hose over, connect it up here. Make sure it's seated all the way and put the clamp back on. Up front here, reconnect your hoses that you disconnected. There we go. Reconnect the throttle body. All right, all the hoses are connected, everything's clamped down. So let's get the intake tube back on. Position your intake tube on, make sure it slides over these two ends and doesn't get pinched. Now reconnect all your vacuum hoses. There was one on the side. There was a wiring harness here for the mass airflow sensor. And then 3 in the back right here. A big one, a medium, and a small. All right. Let's tighten up these clamps. I'm going to start with this one on the throttle body. Make sure the intake duct is pressed firmly up against the throttle body. Make that nice and snug. Don't over tighten it because these break easily. And let's get the throttle body cover back in place. Reinstall your two 10mm nuts and snug them up. Now you can reconnect your battery. Make sure it's nice and snug. At this point you want to start the engine. Obviously make sure it starts. If it doesn't start, there's an issue with something. So check electrical connections, check the battery connection, make sure that's good. Assuming it does start, which it should, go ahead and let it run. Make sure the cooling system bleeds because there was some air that got in right there by the throttle body, so make sure that gets bled out. If needed, top off the cooling system, but don't open this when it's hot. You can top it off in here if you want when it's hot. Other than that, Make sure you don't have any check engine lights from vacuum leaks or unplugged connectors. Make sure you don't have any running conditions. Maybe you switched around two of the coils or the fuel injectors by accident, so make sure that's all good. And other than that, take it for a road test.